Well, thank you everybody for, I would normally say coming, but I guess tuning in is the most appropriate thing to. The last time I gave a talk to the Cambridge Antiquarian Society, I had terrible flu and I lost my voice towards the end of the talk. This time it looks like technical difficulties may be the only thing that will be upon us. Obviously we've experienced some already. Hopefully you can all hear me. And you can see my slides and things will run smoothly from here. So what I'm going to do is give you a very brief background to the gestation of this project, how it all came about, our interest in Antarctica more broadly. So there is going to be elements here that goes well beyond South Georgia, but the focus will very much be upon South Georgia and the project itself. The field work of which was initiated in February and March 2019. In many respects, this story begins 5 or 6 years ago. In 2012, Professor Oppenheimer, a volcanologist at the University of Cambridge, was working out towards Mount Erebus on Ross Island and came across what he believed to be, and indeed was, the resting place of Scott's 1912 Terra Nova expedition. It's the last campsite of which there could well be various items of interest and other things of heritage value. It was anticipated that an archaeological survey would be conducted at this site, both to retrieve facts, but also to look at the impact of that human footprint, its historical impact at both an artifactual level, but also a chemical level, bringing in the newest techniques that we have to our resources. Now, he approached Christopher Evans, who is our director at the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, and whilst we are still hoping that this sort of project will go ahead at some point in the future, it hasn't done so yet, but it gives an indication of at least our broader ambitions here. Nevertheless, fast forward to 2016 and a symposium at the Scott Polar Research Institute on historical Antarctic sealing industry, organised by Brian Lintott and financially supported by the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research. And this was the first real opportunity in Cambridge to bring together specialists in both the history and archaeology of this particular industry with a focus on the Antarctic. Now, given that Cambridge is a hub for Antarctic research more generally, it was important really that this sort of conference took place in this city here. And it was here also where the first discussions took place, again with Christopher Evans, and this time with Bob Burton seated centre front here of the South Georgia Heritage Trust. Now, this is a charitable organisation that's done an enormous amount of work in South Georgia, most recently eradicating the islands of its rat infestation. So a huge number of very important projects, and the discussions began at around this time to try and initiate an archaeological project in the island. Well, it took a few years. Both discussion and design takes a long time in these faraway shores. It's logistically challenging and financially extremely challenging. But nevertheless, we've had the support of a number of institutions. The MacDonald Institute, again, very much focused here with National Geographic and many others involved. And to illustrate the importance of collaborative partnerships here, you can see the range of institutions involved. And they're supporting both financially as well as with equipment, logistics, and of course just general knowledge of this difficult and important environment. Just want to point your attention to these characters at the centre. This is our field team. Not only the crew of the Hans Hansen vessel, which is in the background of that picture, amongst all the penguins, but also a series of individuals, both Neil Golding from the South Atlantic Environment Research Institute, whose Darwin-funded coastal mapping project enabled him to be a part of the team and to conduct a series of drone surveys, the results of which you will see throughout this presentation. They're magnificent images and films in their own right. But importantly also, there is a team of 6 members here. They are citizen scientists, all of whom have had experience previously in South Georgia as tourists. Here they formed part of our team, and really it was their support, both financially, but also in terms of their blood, sweat and toil, and bringing in not only their vast experience of the island and their broader expertise in other fields as well, but also their great humor and their companionship. And it's without their support, this project really could not have gone ahead. And it's also to the credit of the government of South Georgia, because as tourism is growing, it's up to about, well, until this year, of course, it was up to about 10,000 tourists a year. It's heavily moderated. Permits are required at particular landing stations, and there's only a certain number of tourist destinations that can be accessed. So this was a big step for them to enable a team such as this to access different parts of the island that would normally be closed to non-science personnel. So we thank them indeed for their support. Now, before I go into the actual South Georgia project, I just want to give you a flavour of how this has spurned other projects across the region and how we'd like to take this a little bit further in due course. So for example, just before lockdown this year, in February, working in partnership with the Falkland Islands Museum and National Trust, my colleague Tim Clack from St Peter's College in Oxford, and again with the financial support of the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research, I went to the Falkland Islands, particularly Port Stanley, where a new housing development was taking place on the west side of the town, and it was effectively going to be placed directly on top of a World War II British military camp, the most southerly of the conflict. And very little of this now remains owing to development over the last 30 or 40 years. So again, a community-based project with a fantastic resource of documentary evidence, but the first time that any real intrusive archaeological works have been conducted on the island. And of course, the story of the Falkland Islands is very much a partnership narrative with the South Georgia island, which we'll touch upon later in this talk as well. Obviously can't go into this in any great detail here, but suffice to say there was a wealth of World War II remains, but overlying that, the remains of 1982 Argentine depositions and the artifacts from which, well, it's a sensitive subject still today, but I hope that this archaeological project offers an alternative means of entry to that discussion, debate, and historical narrative. So let's get on to South Georgia. Obviously, I know that some of the people that have tuned in today know a great deal about South Georgia and have been there many times, many more times than myself. Other people, of course, will know very little indeed. So I'm going to give a little bit of background here about the island itself. Well, it's 103 miles in length, it's 22 miles wide, and its location just off the southern tip of South America means that it's about 800 miles west from the Falkland Islands at its nearest point, and almost 430 miles north from the South Sandwich Islands. So it really is in a very remote part of the Southern Ocean. And its coast, as you can see here, is indented with these deep fjords, the majority of which are capped by glaciers that reach into this interior spine of high mountainous peaks, extremely inhospitable along that central corridor. So the majority of human activity is situated along its outer coastline. And of course, it was that central difficult mountainous landscape that Shackleton traversed in 1916 after his failed expedition upon the Endurance. And if you've heard anything of South Georgia, it might well be that Shackleton's grave is located there at the town of Grytviken on the whaling station. The first recorded landing on the island is around 1775, Captain James Cook. at which point he claimed sovereignty for the United Kingdom. He didn't think much about the island. In fact, he was quite despondent about it, other from the fact that it was teeming with wildlife. But it was that wildlife that really took note for many people, given the fact that this was seals, whales, and other beasts of the sort. The project was mainly focused on the north side of the island. The north side is defined by human activity, mainly because it is shielded from those southerly Antarctic winds and heavy stormy seas. But nonetheless, there are a number of sites on the south side, and we would like to be filling in this map with more numbers in subsequent seasons if possible. But there are 17 landing sites in total. Not all of them have sort of dense archaeological remains, but you'll get a flavour of what some of these are about in due course. Logistically, South Georgia is an incredibly difficult place for an archaeologist. Actually getting onto the shore requires small vessels. In fact, getting into the fjords themselves requires a vessel that is able to access them. Our vessel, the Hans Hansen, is an old lifeboat, Norwegian lifeboat. It means that you feel every single wave on the 5-day journey there, which, if you're not used to being on a boat, is a real baptism of fire, as the majority of our team found out. I had all these grand ideas of writing an article on the way, absolutely hidden for much of the journey. And of course, from one day to the next, the weather can change rapidly. 24 hours is a very long time in South Georgia. It can be bright sunshine one day, rarely, but we were lucky enough to enjoy a large amount of that. Within 24 hours, it can be absolutely snow-capped and extremely difficult for the sort of work that we normally do. And of course, there's the local inhabitants. It doesn't have a permanent human population, although there is a human presence throughout the year, mostly from the British Antarctic Survey. But of course, these guys, we were there in the non-breeding season, so it was relatively low in terms of population density of penguins, seals, and the like. But nevertheless, enough of them to be, well, pretty curious about what we were doing, and often getting in the way. But inevitably we were stomping on their territory, so it's just one of the things you have to live with. Now, South has an enormous heritage, built heritage across much of. Majority of that relates to these 20th century whaling stations. The majority of the whaling stations were closed down in the first half of the 20th century. The last of those closed in the 1960s when whaling was effectively outlawed and then heavily regulated. The remains of those whaling stations are today rusting hulks. Pretty dangerous, really. Bits of debris flying all over the place in the strong winds. And as you can see, littered also with the carcasses and remains of these large whales. And much of this sort of built heritage has been very much the focus of archaeological surveys on the island previously, and the sort of heritage statements and conservation agendas that the island has designed over the last few years. And rightly so, they are very much a tourist attraction, and they're an important part of the island's ecological history in its own right. What we've tried to do with this particular project is to expand that view, to gain a sense that its archaeological heritage is much less easily visible, is transient, is requiring of a different methodological approach, and also therefore possibly a different conservation approach. And this particular project has been very much an assessment level analysis to try and understand its capacity, potential, character, date, and so on. And we're still in the process of going through the analysis. Unfortunately, the lockdown has presented a number of difficulties, as you can imagine, for completing that analysis, but we're pretty close now. So much of our attention has been the earliest human activity on the island. Now that relates to hunting predominantly, and that's hunting of seals first, and then subsequently whales as well. The two seal populations on the island are the southern elephant seal and the Antarctic fur seal. The elephant hunted for its blubber, for oil. The Antarctic fur seal also for blubber to a certain degree, but mostly for its pelts, all of which was contributing to a burgeoning capitalist network and industry across the globe. Both New York, London, Canton in China were the major markets for the fur trade in particular. The oil trade was a growing trade, certainly in the late 18th, early 19th century, and became substantial towards the middle part of the 19th century. The result, of course, was catastrophic for the seal population of South Georgia. By the 1830s, the vast majority of the elephant seal and the fur seal population in particular had been almost eradicated. Subsequently, that meant that hunting was not quite so successful. There were certain respite periods, partly due also to European wars, but ultimately they were restarted at different points throughout the 19th century. And the impact was, well, substantial to the degree that the population was almost entirely eradicated. It's not the sexiest subject in the world when you go to a funding body to say, I would like to look at essentially the genocide of an entire population. But actually, that's not really our focus here. In a way, the sealing industry is a vehicle for us to understand human impact, the traces of human impact as they survive long term in these types of environments. And we've expanded it also beyond the remit of the sealing industry to take into account other facets of the island's heritage that leaves an archaeological trace. And I'll touch upon those as we go through this presentation. So what sort of traces of the sealing industry might be extant upon the island and encountered through our survey? Well, there is, of course, the industrial components themselves. Now, these large iron pots called try-pots, part of the try-works, which is the mechanics behind the actual industrial processing of blubber in this case. These are the sort of things that you can imagine survive pretty well in any environment. The majority of these were first manufactured across the UK, particularly in the Midlands, and then in different workshops down in London and elsewhere. You can buy these on eBay very cheaply today and use them as garden pots and other items, and they are sort of things that you see in many museums of folklore and 19th century activities. Essentially, you boil the blubber, rendering oil from the fat, scooping off impurities that float to the surface. It's a smelly, dirty, sticky enterprise. And much of this would have been conducted first during the passage on the vessels themselves in these manufactured installations made of brick and stone, holding the vessels above a furnace and an oven. And then once activities were taken to shore, the pots themselves were also transported to shore, and invariably those were left in situ, and the remains of those are seen at different points across the island today in various states of, well, essentially disrepair. Some of these are almost entirely buried. The one in the top right of this picture at Elsa Hall, we did excavate and then concealed once more. There is possibly a typology to these that could be chronologically significant. This is something that we're trying to look into, but as of yet, that is, again, owing to the lockdown, proving to be rather difficult at this stage. Anybody that's been to the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge will see that there is one of these pots outside the buildings. This is actually from South Georgia, and You know, it's something that certainly anybody should go and see today if they can. What about the actual additional activities, the living conditions of these individuals, all of whom we believe were men? There may have been one or two women at later stages in the expedition to South Georgia, but the documentary sources do tell us that it is predominantly a male activity. They also tell us that the sort of material traces should be relating to a very transient type of settlement. And excavations on the islands off the Antarctic Peninsula itself that have been conducted since the 1990s suggest also that this is the case, with rock overhangs being utilized with low stone walls as a form of shelter. And there's evidence also within those particular locations that small boats that would have been utilized to get from your main vessel to shore might have been upended and used as some means of shelter as well. So ultimately, those sorts of traces will be very sparse and very difficult to identify. But you can see in this image, which admittedly from the Falkland Islands, suggests that there's a whole range of material items that are being brought to shore, and in theory at least, should be the sort of things that we might be able to find. So I'm going to run through some of the sites that we encountered that we have at least got reasonable evidence for these being sealing activity related sites from the 19th century, if not earlier. This site, the first one here, is again one of these rock shelters, such as the sort that were described within those documentary sources. Other types of sites are much more substantial in their architecture, which I'll move on to in just a moment. But here at Kalaita Bay, we had two of these rock shelters. They are relatively transient in the way that they have been survived. There seems to be a low stone and possibly tussock wall, tussock being this tall, very peaty grass that grows up to 2 meters in height across much of the island's coastal fringes. And that can be easily cut and almost into these sort of very large bricks and piled upon one another to create a decent shelter. And often we do find that there are traces of some sort of hearth structure inside of these buildings. The hearths themselves are heavily congealed, concretized masses, potentially the combination of sand mixed with burnt blubber. Documentary sources suggest that even entire penguins are being thrown on the fire occasionally, burning very brightly and very well, hopefully dead before they went on the fire. We have taken a number of samples from a number of hearths, which are subject to microscopic analysis and careful chemical analysis that might give us further insight to the sort of materials being utilized within those contexts. Additional very subtle and, well, weakly preserved sites are these more sort of open area sites. Larsen Harbour has long been known as a site of potential. Various of these tripods have been found along the coastal shore, but clearly ex situ, well away from their original location of use. There's a limited amount of tussock that still exists across the coastline there. That seems to have encased some earlier traces of human activity, but the number of seals that are now living on these shorelines, particularly throughout the throughout the breeding season, is starting to erode through that tussock, revealing traces of these archaeological remains. This particular one barely survived at all, and unfortunately we had just, well, less than an hour to really deal with this before the weather absolutely turned on us. We had to return to the vessel, and unfortunately didn't have an opportunity to return to this. But it consists of a brick and stone lined hearth. The brick, unfortunately, is too poorly preserved to really take any proper samples or see any signature marks on them that might indicate an origin or a date. But again, a series of charcoal deposits in situ with this time timber planking and a series of timber pegs. So it illustrates that there is something underneath this tussock that is relatively substantial, well preserved, but unfortunately we do need to have a more sustained period of time at these sorts of sites in particular to enable us to build a better view and understanding of their condition, their date, and their overall expanse. The second type site, very different character. Now this site type that really you do not see the south, further and closer to the Antarctic Peninsula. This is really quite unusual. We've got a number of sites that have this sort of character. It effectively consists of reused timber planks, either from wrecked vessels or being taken from the vessels themselves for a purposefully laid foundation. This particular example at Albatross Cove on Cooper Bay, only a very partial amount of this had ever been exposed, and really its exact character was not really appreciated until this particular project. I'm going to show you a very brief video clip just to give you a real sense of the landscape location and also the sort of tightly bound context of this particular floor. This doesn't have sound, so I'll talk along with it, but I hope you get a real sense also of what the drone footage is able to give us in this particular case. Pretty rugged and barren, beautiful in its own right. You can see the team just outside of the entrance to the cove, which is horseshoe shaped, open to the watery elements. This is the main bay. And cove. You can just make out the timber floor inside, exposed, partially exposed, but pretty well preserved. This is partly encased by a layer of tussock, heavily eroded, of course, by seals, as inevitably is the case. On one side of the cove was a small stone-lined hearth, once again, and again we were able to sample this. It was riddled with small flakes of bone, which are either part of somebody's last meal or, again, part of the actual fuel being laid into this fire. And this is currently being analysed by Laura Cotto of the University of Cambridge, a PhD student here. And the actual timber footing of this building, along the frontage of which had some sort of remains of either a timber screen or maybe even a timber roof that had collapsed onto the front of the cove itself. When we removed this and opened a couple of small trenches towards the face of the cove, it became pretty clear that there was a small stone wall enclosing the cove, protecting it, sheltering the occupants. The outside of that was shingle, presumably from heavy waves, heavy storms. But inside of, between the cove, between the stone wall and the actual timber floor, were the remnants of one of these tussock walls. And again, we've been able to take samples from that tussock, inside of which are going to be environmental indicators, possibly also insects and insect casings. What we're hoping is this will be an alternative entry into the environmental history of at least this part of South Georgia Island. It's very difficult to date environmental remains from the 19th century, radiocarbon not being overly successful for this sort of for this sort of time period. But this allows an alternative insight to a localized environmental situation. And again, that's something that is underway. Lockdown having really put a long delay on the results coming through from that, unfortunately. In amongst all the material overlying the timber flooring, one of our colleagues, Andrew, on the bottom left here, holding up part of a clay pipe. You'll get to see this in close-up view in due course, but it is really one of the better finds that we had throughout the project, this sort of item being not only relatively datable, but often you get in signatures, maybe even initials marked onto the name that gives a personal element to this particular item's manufacture. Now I want to move on to a site where you'll see something very different indeed. Here, much more substantial material remains that actually gives a very different picture, something entirely contrary to the documentary evidence that we were expecting to encounter. It's on the north side of the island, and it entails a number of stone and timber structures, at least 3 areas of condensed archaeological remains. And there's up to, well, there's certainly the remains of 4 structures, maybe more, but they are in, unfortunately, a state of quite extreme disrepair. But nevertheless, and as you can see from this image, there's enough to be giving us a fair insight to the activities taking place here. I have to stress that the unusual nature of this particular site, we don't see anything like this elsewhere so far on South Georgia, and certainly in the islands off of the Antarctic Peninsula, this really would be unique. The primary buildings themselves are pretty substantial. They survive to 2 to 3/4 of stone. They do have a number of timber elements inside as well. We weren't able to do an excavation here, of course. We had just a few days to record what we were able to record, and it's an assessment exercise, so minimal intrusion at this stage was really paramount. This is telling me that my internet connection is unstable. I hope you can all still hear me. I'm going to focus on this particular area here, where we've got 3 large tripods, part of the tri-works, still in situ, more or less, and a number of potential sampling opportunities here for which data is now starting to come through. The tripods themselves, very substantial, very similar to the ones that I showed to you earlier. And excavation revealed that they are still encased within a combination of brick and stone architecture, essentially 2 ovens in which was concealed a fairly decent stratigraphy of deposits with decent charcoal layers still preserved in situ. On top of that black band of charcoal that you can see here in this drawn section were a series of windblown sands, suggesting that the pots were elevated above that layer, held aloft, and it suggests that they were held by some sort of iron scaffolding, the remnants of which are here in a collapsed state. And a number of iron doors to the ovens were still within the vicinity, and all suggesting that there is a serious building here that gives a real, very different picture to this transience, this impermanent sense of activity. Here we've got sites that can be visited and revisited on subsequent occasions, maybe even by subsequent and successive generations of sealers. You get a sense of place emerging here, a sense maybe of memory and other forms of narrative being built around this particular location. These are ideas that can be expanded upon in subsequent seasons. In terms of material items here, not a huge amount of material culture. You'll see a number of the pieces that we found in the coming slides. But there was a science hut here from the 1960s and 1970s, affiliated with the British Antarctic Survey, which may well have had an impact on the survival of material remains here, but more importantly, it was the cleanup of that hut that we think has also unfortunately cleaned up some of the archaeological traces as well. But there is still elements of the 19th year for us to investigate. The charcoal that is within the ovens has now been analysed, and it is showing that it is a pine, clearly material that's being imported to South Georgia. There are no trees at South Georgia, no timber resources, everything has to be brought ashore. So this has travelled some distance, and the majority of this material is available in Northern Europe, but some of it seems to be potentially black pine, which really is a Southern Europe material. But I think a little bit further work is required to really gain a handle on that with some certainty. I mentioned that really this is a unique sort of site, and there doesn't seem to be any real comparisons within the Antarctic region. If we look a little further afield to New Zealand, then we do start to see comparative structures. I'm not going to suggest that these are New Zealanders coming to South Georgia, but it does at least give us opportunities for comparative research. And there's a number of sites of this type that you might find along the coastal fringes of New Zealand. And again, it would be interesting to see if Australasian sealers on different parts of the Antarctic Peninsula are leaving these sorts of traces behind in their endeavours. Also at Elsa Hall, a large timber structure. Now, again, the material of this timber has been analysed in Cambridge by the Ring Growth Lab in the Geography Department. Ulf Buntingen, Professor Ulf Buntingen's team has been able to look at this, and again, telling us that this is also of a pine species. The hope is that we will be able to do further work with this material, maybe even dendrochronological work that will give us a much tighter time frame for this type of site. But this analysis is only just, or the results of this analysis has only come through in the last week or so. So we wait to see what possibilities lie here. But again, the fairly small scale investigations have illustrated that there's a substantial amount of timber still sealed beneath the sands here that further excavation would certainly benefit from. And I think that we're going to see some interesting information coming out of this site in subsequent years. Just to further highlight the unusual nature of some of the sites on this north side of South Georgia, Bird Island, a small island just sort of almost a stone's throw from Elsa Hall. You can just make out the British Antarctic Survey Station here on Bird Island, and we were thrilled to have a whole day working here. I'm told that it has 4 days of sun a year. This must have been one of those 4 days. It was absolutely beautiful. And the main site that we were working with down on this southern part of this particular bay. And again, it's of unusual character. Substantial stone-walled dwelling of some form, but then with a low stone promontory, or maybe a wall that has been substantially removed by no doubt the elements, if not human activities. You can see there's also a low stone cairn. There's the remains of try-works or try-pots hidden within the peat overgrowth. Another timber structure of some form down in this this part of the site, images of which you can now see here, and a number of whale bones that have been fashioned in some form, presumably to be used within the structural matrix of this particular series of buildings. So this is one that has only been very briefly surveyed, but again, it gives this sense that there's a real permanence to some of these sites, a character that is unusual, and that certainly requires further work to gain a clearer sense of understanding. The fact that this one is also partially encased within tussock and within a soil overburden also means that the scale of preservation could also be pretty decent. So this one too holds great promise, I think. So some of the sort of material items that are coming from a number of these sites again give further insight. Here we've got the tools of the trade, if you like. A lance on the top right, a flesh hook, some form of flensing tool, a chisel, and then obviously this unusual stone item, possibly being used as a depth gauge within one of the smaller vessels. Of course, it could have been used for holding down an awning. There's a whole number, answers on a postcard, I think, with that. But nevertheless, a full range of different items relating to the practice of sailing. In terms of personal effects, many of these items are housed within the South Georgia Museum in Grytviken. I'd love to say that we found these. We did find the buttons and the small piece of leather in the bottom right, but again, this gives us a sense of indication towards what sort of materials potentially could be found across South Georgia, still in a very good state of preservation. The felt hat in the top left corner was found with penguin eggshells inside of it, and the boot down on the bottom left is of a type that I'm hoping to get analysed and get a little bit further information on that too. But all of this is really nice insight towards the sort of clothing and items that would have been utilised by these pretty hardy individuals. And in terms of personal effects, well, they wouldn't have had a great deal that they would have wanted to take ashore with them, but nevertheless, coffee and smoking would have been two of the major things of the time, understandably so. A number of pipes have been found over the years at different parts of South Georgia. Unfortunately, we think that a lot of them have been, let's say, souvenired, and probably found new homes in different parts of the world. But this particular pipe has the initials S and J. This is the one from Albatross Cove. And the inscriptions on the pipe, a sort of laurel leaf pattern, are exactly the same as many of the pipes that are housed within that Grytviken museum. So there's something unusual going on there. We've even got a stream of tobacco preserved from Diaz Cove, a site we weren't able to access, but on the southern part of the island. And what looks like, well, it's a piece of lead, which could be a tamper for patting down tobacco into a pipe, and then a pouch for holding the pipe in place. And then various containers, either for liquids, for boiling, or for maybe containing oil and other items. The bottles are glass. I think most of these probably are early 20th century, and so relating more to maybe even the British Antarctic Survey from the later part of the 20th century, but just an indication of the range of material types that are coming from some of these sites. Amongst some of the more interesting pieces, though, from our own project, the base of an iron pot from a site called Larsen Harbour, which essentially would have been a storage station. And this, being excavated here by Alex, one of our citizen scientists, was just one piece of this pot. When we took that piece to the museum in Grytviken, the curator there rustled around in the archives and came out with a second piece of pot from the same site, which you can see fitted beautifully. One of those sort of eureka moments, really. By using various digital technologies today, we can essentially reconstruct it and get a sense of its shape and form. And it's something that we had looked into then having a 3D reconstruction. Too will be something that the museum will be able to display in their museum in due course. And of course, items of the vessels themselves. A lot of this washes up on shore, but some of it is being brought ashore also by the sealers and the whalers. Mostly nails. We find a lot of those on a lot of 19th century sites, in Cambridge as well, of course. But the timber from these vessels is valuable not only because it tells us about some of the wrecks that are sadly finding their way across these shores, but it's the actual material of the wood itself. Here are a number of items of driftwood, also other items of vessels, and let's also not forget those timber floors. Now, this material does not occur in South Georgia naturally. It is either finding its way through the currents or through human agency. Analysis of any of these materials should be able to enlighten about the changing pattern of currents and the changing pattern also of the vessel wrecks, because we have got a fairly decent documentary resource where most wreck sites occurred. If we can start to identify some of this wreck material, the majority is not going to be actually where the wreck was first occurred in the 19th century. So hopefully that pattern and that dynamic of tidal drift is something that we can explore down the line. Now I'm going to touch upon some different types of archaeology within South Georgia here before I finish off. Prince Olaf Harbour, you can see, is one of these impressive whaling stations. This was initiated around about 1916 and was closed down in 1931. Now, you're not allowed into these whaling stations these days, and we didn't have permission to go here, but we did have permission to go to a site overlooking a bay called Seal Cove, and with the view that this may have been a sealing site. When you climb over the ridge, you encounter this unusual arrangement of stones, some of which are architectural, some of which, as you can see, are also natural, and interspersed amongst those a number of whale bones. Now, the whale bones are being used not only as architecture, again, probably to hold up some sort of roofing or awning, but also as furniture, and no doubt being used as seating and tabletops. But there's a really unusual item here that I certainly hadn't expected to come across. I don't think has been seen before in South Georgia, or dare I say in Antarctica. It's a thick piece of glass, probably from a ship's portal. The star here indicates where it came from in the site. And it's not just been bashed around and smashed up, it's actually been carefully knapped. This wonderful illustration here by Mariana from the Cambridge Archaeological Unit illustrates the careful way by which this has been knapped almost into a scraping edge. Now, what we know about Prince Olaf Harbour is that it was the site of a British whaling station, whaling company, that first worked offshore in what we call floating factories. And many of the crew were from different parts of Africa, but particularly from Natal. They were of Zulu ethnicity, and there were a number of Cape Verdeans in and amongst the crew as well, between 30 and 50 Africans in total in 1913 and again in 1914 as well. This is all clearly very clear from documentary sources. Could this be the first sort of material culture of an African population in South Georgia? I think it's a very strong argument here. In the more recent investigations in the Falkland Islands, we found additional glass items that have been knapped into scraping tools, clearly of 1980s origin, with the Falklands conflict and probably Argentinian conscripts. So that comparison here of this glass industry, very unusual, very different, but it speaks of a very different narrative in South Georgia that hasn't really been explored to its fullest potential, certainly not from a material point of view. Another site that we were able to visit is the site of Little Moltke Harbour in Royal Bay, which was a German science station for the International Polar Year of 1882 to 1883. Now, this featured scientists from 11 countries working in 12 different stations around the world in the Arctic, subarctic, and the subantarctic. Now, the team imported sheep, goats, cattle, and planted various crops and things in a garden in South Georgia, all of which their station was substantial, as you can see from this illustration from 1882. Other than the failure of the crops, watercress was successful, although we didn't see any signs of that when we visited the site. And there's a number of items in the Scott Polar Institute collections which have come from this particular location. It has been surveyed previously, but never from an aerial vantage. So our drone survey, which is too substantial to illustrate here, was able to give a bird's eye view of the structures, which we are in the process of mapping and comparing to the surveys that have previously been conducted. It's a really interesting site, which again tells of a different story, the history of science and science expeditions that actually South Georgia has a pretty strong background in, as does the Falkland Islands. So again, this is something that we're trying to explore in greater detail to enhance that story of South Georgia on a different level. And it's through that material component, really, where that story is going to be most legible. That site also has indications of the sort of problems that we face at South Georgia. Now, one of the tasks that the 1882 German team was faced with was to measure the transit of Venus. And for this, they transported equipment from Hamburg, including a dome and a heliometer, which is a measuring device that was very intricate at the time. It was hugely successful. They returned to Germany with the congratulations German Emperor King Wilhelm I. Remains of the Iron Dome through the last sort of 4 or 5 decades. You can see that there really isn't a great deal of it left. And in a way, this is illustrative of what's happening to much of the archaeological sites across South Georgia. Here at Start Point on a site called Salisbury Plain, you can see that the tussock grass, still substantial in places, is becoming heavily eroded by the mammalian activity that now is almost entirely, well actually it is entirely replenished from those days of near extinction. In fact, 95% of the fur seal population from the globe now resides in South Georgia. It's a huge number of animals. It's a great success story of ecological management. For archaeology, though, it's a little in that this tussock that grew along the coastal fringes when the population had become so depleted that there was nothing to effectively erode it, that tussock sealed and preserved the archaeological sites. Now the tussock is becoming heavily eroded, revealing the archaeological sites to the elements, and we have a limited time span now to map, document, and understand these sites. You can just make out a stone-walled structure starting to emerge from this site at Start Point. Half of it has been entirely eroded into the sea. The other half is, well, it's on its way. So another site that we wish to return to in the future. And just to sort of hit home that point of erosion, Elsa Hall, that wonderful stone encased series of tripods. Well, in the 1970s, those tripods were entirely encased in tussock. You couldn't see any of the stone structure and the brick structure whatsoever. Gradually through the decades, that material has become entirely eroded. There is no tussock left at all on the coast, the actual coastal plain of Elsa Hall. And in fact, the brick becoming exposed in 2014 was by 2019 starting to also become heavily eroded. So again, we're starting to see that opportunities are becoming few and far between. At Ocean Harbour, which is a whaling station, which was dismantled, well, it was built in 1909, dismantled in 1920. One of the oldest whaling stations on the island. In 2008, in a relatively decent state of preservation, an archaeological survey was conducted for the remnant buildings of that site. But by 2019, a stream was starting to pass through the entirety of this site, widening and eroding at quite a serious degree, as you can see from this image. Both the remains, but also the geological strata that makes up the majority of this site. This is through meltwater. It's meltwater from the interior islands glaciers, which are rapidly receding. And in a way, what I want to close on is this slide to, again, sort of hit home this point of we have left to do any serious work with these archaeological remains. In the 1950s, the Nuremberg Glacier at Fortuna Bay was nearing the coast that we see today in Fortuna Bay. There's a rock shelter that we were able to investigate, which, well, in the 19th century would effectively have been on the very edge of the glacier. There were a number of sites that we visited across South Georgia in which we were asking to ourselves, why on earth is there a sealing site here? It seems so remote and out of the way. Of course, the answer is that it was not once remote and out of the way. It was on the edge of a teeming environment that has now become entirely lost or transformed. In this instance, between 1990 and 2016, the glacier was seen to retreat 5.6 kilometers. And whilst the glacial meltwaters looks rather beautiful, as you can see from this image at a site called Kalaita Bay, ultimately it tells of a sad story of, well, probably irreversible change. Those glaciers hold a wealth of environmental historical information. Are we ever going to be able to do anything with that? Well, to a certain degree it has been, but not to the degree that you would wish for any sort of Antarctic environment. And the archaeological remains hidden within that environment are also deeply under threat today. Our hope is that the sort of work that we're carrying out will be able to gestate subsequent seasons of investigation and a new and alternative means of entry to many of these environmental histories, as well as the heritage histories of islands like South Georgia and more broadly across the Antarctic. Thank you very much for your time this evening. And I think if you have any questions, they can be submitted through the chat function. And Rob, if we ever see him again, we'll fire them through and I'll do my best to answer.
Marcus, I am restored, and my apologies for disappearing earlier on. We have overrun a little bit, but we have a backlog of questions for you, Marcus, so we'll try and whip through these ones so that we try and get through everything we've got here. To start off with, one from John Samuelson. He's curious to know why the installations you've looked at are mostly buried. Is it a result of sediment produced by glacial melting, or is it just a factor of time, or what are the other factors involved?
Presumably the question relates to being buried in sands, and yeah, it's a combination. I mean, there is almost a constant flow of water on a number of these sites. Again, partly through the natural melting that takes place throughout the summer seasons, but also being now accelerated by the retreat of the glacial core, and that does transport the sands at a rapid rate in some instances. You'd like to think that it is also going to be concealing and preserving some of those archaeological sites, but no doubt it does also erode a number of them at a consistent rate. And I think I've explained already the reason why some of them are encased in tussock, but those two soon to be exposed and subject to erosion.
Okay, a question here from Lex. Did you employ a metal detector to locate metal items, or would it be useful to use one for future investigations?
We did take a metal detector, and it was very useful. Anything that was identified was given a GPS coordinate. We had discussed and agreed with the government of South Georgia a very detailed approach towards artifacts, whether they would be recovered or left in situ, or put into a place in which they would be hopefully safe from any erosion or disappearance in the due course. And the items that we did collect will be offered to the South Georgia Museum at Grytviken as for part of their exhibit, and hopefully also for a travelling exhibit and display, not only in Cambridge but elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. From a question from Bruce here, would Svalbard offer similar examples of tripod structures and ovens, given the transfer of whaling and sealing from the Arctic to the sub-Antarctic?
There's a lot of really interesting archaeology at Svalbard. And obviously some of it is contemporaneous with the sort of things that we're seeing at South Georgia. I haven't seen any comparable structures other than the timber structures. From that point of view, there is a resource there that offers a pretty decent comparison. But when it comes to the stone encased tri-works, still there's little in that sort of part of the Arctic that is useful for comparison. But we'll keep looking, and certainly if you know of anything, then do send it through. But yeah, Svalbard's a very good comparison, also for the methodologies that we've been using with the drone footage from the point of view of hopefully conservation and management. They're a little bit further ahead than we are, but we're utilizing some of their ideas as models for the future.
A question here from Maker. Do you have any idea how many wrecks are present around South Georgia, and how far away from the coast are they located?
There's a publication by Bob Headland, I think in Polar Review, which does list the known wrecks. Off the top of my head, I can't say how many. I think it's about 130, but certainly there will be many more as well, we suspect. Some of them are in the deeper waters around the coastline of South Georgia. None have really been investigated. One has been visited very briefly by divers, and clearly there are very interesting items within that wreck. I personally feel that some of these wrecks have the best archaeological remains inside. I mean, clearly they're not, the sealers and shore-based whalers are not taking a huge number of personal items to shore. So yeah, in the future, that is something that we are considering as an exploration. I personally specialize in people that have expressed an interest. In the future, that will be something that we can achieve.
The last question. Did Seamus McCann of the British Antarctic Survey build a series of pine walkways for his research on elephant seals in the 1970s?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please? Sorry
about that. Seamus McCann of the British Antarctic Survey built a series of pine walkways in Elsa Hall as part of his research on elephant. A question from Diaz Cove.
Yes, actually, he had a hut at Elsa Hall, and you can just about see the remnants of that, but the majority of it was removed by the British Antarctic Survey in sometime in the 2000s. And there are photographs with the hut still extant in the 1970s, around which there's still a pretty strong overgrowth of tussock. So the tussock itself, by that time, is concealing the pine timber structure, which we were investigating. So I don't think that is directly related to that particular example. Yeah, it's something that we have considered, but no, I don't think it's a part of that particular science station.
Okay, Marcus, one more before your internet connection gives out. A question from Ori. What is the oldest finding you've been able to locate?
I heard what's the oldest finding. I didn't hear the rest, but I'll work on that. I suppose one of the frustrations in a way is that absolute dating of any of the sites or the materials that we've encountered so far is not really possible. So we can say that there is an early 19th century element to this, and that's given the type of materials that are coming up from some of these sites, allied again with documentary sources. If I could give an absolute date to anything, then I'd be very pleased, and of course that would help to answer your question. But as of yet, that's not been possible. But all I can say is watch this space, come to the next talk, I might have the answer.
Marcus, thank you very much for talk on a bit of the world that I think many of us here will never have the opportunity to actually visit. So thank you very much indeed. I have new chat board here asking to pass on thanks. So, thank you very much from all of us this evening. It is very much appreciated. Before we wrap up, I'll remind you of our next lecture will be on the Monday, the 7th of December, between Jeremy Musson and London's oldest synagogue. For those of you that are not members of the Society but have been any of the ones we have in future, we have a full program on our website. Please do visit. Membership for the Society is only £20 per year. But from all of us in Cambridge this evening, thank you, Marcus, and thank you all of us for joining us this evening. Good night.